This last video about periods is going to cover the whole of human history and prehistory, to put the periods we looked at in the other two videos into some context. It's a bit more international than the other two videos, but it's still mainly intended to provide some background to what was happening in Britain. So this blue bar represents the whole of human history, about 3 million years. And that's from about the time when hominids, that's species that from which modern humans are descended, started acting in ways that we might consider human, started doing things like using tools. This began in Africa, and humans didn't really reach northwestern Europe until about 800,000 years ago. So this red bar represents the period in which people have lived in northwestern Europe. They turn up a little bit earlier, around the Mediterranean. Now let's stretch out the timeline a bit so that the scale increases and we can look at this 800,000 year period in a little more detail. And in fact, even if we stretch out to fill the whole screen, it's still too long to be able to see most of the periods of history at a useful size. So let's put a mark here at 10,000 years and then stretch it out again so that last 10,000 years fills the screen. And that lets us look at most of the periods that we begin to be interested in as historians, as local historians. And the first important division on this timeline is that between history and prehistory. And this is just the difference between the time for which there are written records, the time after writing had been invented, and the time before writing, prehistory being before history. The time at which prehistory turns into history is different in different places, because it depends upon when writing was invented or when it reached anywhere in particular. So the earliest writing was in the Middle East from around 3200 BC. In China, writing was invented independently a little bit later, about 1500 BC. Writing was invented also in South America at about 500 BC. In Europe, writing moves across Western Europe and Northern Europe with the Roman Empire, and that's how it reaches Britain. So British history begins with the Roman Conquest in about 43 AD. Now, of course, some people, Julius Caesar, Strabo, had written about Britain as a distant land, so it's not that there aren't any written sources before 43 AD, but that's when people begin using writing routinely in Britain. Now, the difference between history and prehistory is not necessarily clear-cut. You might come across the term proto-history, particularly in books or articles about the very earliest historic societies in the Middle East. People often describe a proto-historic period before there are large volumes of written records, and a period in which, whilst we have some documents, we don't have enough to write a proper narrative history. So that's proto-history. We don't really talk about proto-history in Britain or in Western Europe. In places that Europeans colonized outside Europe, where there hadn't been writing beforehand, places like North America or Australia, where the indigenous inhabitants weren't using writing, the historic period is the period following European colonization. And it's a little problematic. Be careful about using the term prehistoric to describe people whose quite recent descendants are still around, its cultures still exist, as prehistoric because it's patronising and it's demeaning. But nonetheless, the term historic is used to describe the period after European colonisation in many parts of the world. This is a pertinent point to discuss the difference between BC and AD. So in Western societies, typically we count years from the birth of Jesus Christ, that being naught. We count forward from that for AD, Anno Domini, and we count backwards from it for BC. So anything prior to the year naught is BC and anything after it is AD. And conveniently in Britain this is actually very close to the end of prehistory, which comes in Britain 43 years after the birth of Christ, thereabouts. We count the centuries using this system as well. So the first century AD is that from 0 up to 99. The second century is from 100 to 199, and so on and so forth for AD. And then for BC, you count backwards from 0. So the first century BC begins in the year 99 BC and goes through to 0. The second century starts in the year 199 BC and goes through to 100. I find the simplest way to figure out the name of a century is to, if you take the year and you knock off the last two digits and then add 1 to whatever you've got left. That's the most straightforward way. So for example, we're in 2021. You knock off the 21 on the end of that, which leaves you with 20. If you add 1 to that, you get 21. We're in the 21st century, and indeed we are. So it's always 1, the name of the century is always 1 ahead of the number at the beginning of the year. So let's look in a bit more detail at the periods of prehistory. And traditionally, prehistory is divided into 3 periods. It's called the 3-age system. It's the Stone Age, which is grey here, the Bronze Age in brown, and the Iron Age in dark grey. And the Stone Age is by far the longest, really it's the majority of human history. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the blue bar that we've stretched out an awful long way to the left side of the screen. And because the Stone Age is so long, in practice, the term Stone Age is really very rarely used, and it's divided itself into 3 parts: the Paleolithic, Old Stone Age, the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, and the Neolithic, the New Stone Age. That leaves 5 basic periods of prehistory. The majority of human history is still the Paleolithic, which goes back, of course, all the way to the beginning of the timeline 3 million years ago, and only comes to an end about 10,000 years ago in Britain. And the Paleolithic includes the Ice Age, or really more accurately, the Ice Ages, because there were successive periods of cooler conditions in which ice sheets advanced into Europe and indeed other continents too. And these periods are called glacials, and then between those, when conditions warm up and the ice sheets retreat, you have periods called interglacials. And these come to an end at about the end of the Paleolithic period. And the Paleolithic is followed by the Mesolithic. between about 10,000 years ago and about 6,000 years ago in Britain. And it's during this period, about 8,500 years ago, that Britain becomes an island. In other parts of the world, in particularly the Middle East, there isn't a clear period between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic, and so people tend to talk of an epi-Paleolithic in between, sort of the very end of the Paleolithic period, rather than having a defined Mesolithic era. The next period is the Neolithic. This is important because it's the period in which farming first occurs, and also the first use of ceramics. Farming again begins in the Middle East, around modern-day Syria, and spreads gradually across the European continent, reaching Britain in about 4000 BC. The Neolithic continues to about 2600 BC. In some periods right at the end of the Neolithic, there's a period in which people begin to use copper, and sometimes this is called the Chalcolithic, the Copper Age. But that's rarely talked about in Britain. The Bronze Age, fairly obviously, is the period in which people start making and using bronze. In Britain, it runs from about 2600 to 800 BC. That's followed by the Iron Age, again, fairly obviously, when people start using iron, from 800 BC to, in the case of Britain, 43 AD, or in other places, whenever it is that history happens to begin. The Iron Age is the last period of prehistory, whenever that happens to come to an end. Now, whilst Britain was having its Bronze Age and its Iron Age, some important and quite familiar things were happening in the Mediterranean, in North Africa. They're historic periods because whilst this was British prehistory, writing was being used in the Mediterranean or in parts of it. But they're contemporary with British Northern European prehistory. Ancient Egypt, which most of us are familiar with, large museum collections that have ended up in the UK. It's a really long period across most of the British Bronze and Iron Ages. It's represented here with this blue line. Ancient Greece, similarly, is familiar and become quite an important influence on modern Western European culture. That goes from equivalent of the British Late Bronze Age through the Iron Age, or although it depends on what you consider to be ancient Greece. In technical terms, I've included the Archaic period and the Classical period, but that really need to worry about that. And then, of course, we have ancient Rome, which we've represented in red. That starts near the beginning of the Iron Age. That's when the Roman Republic was established, and continues through to sometime in the middle of the 5th century AD, depending on what you consider to be the end of it, at least in the West. However, importantly, after the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the Eastern Roman Empire in modern-day Greece and Turkey and parts of the Middle East continued and became known as the Byzantine Empire, and that continued, represented by this purple line right up, until the middle of the 15th century. Now, the Greek and Roman periods together are sometimes called Antiquity, or sometimes the Classical period. So just to bring this back to where the first video started, let's stretch out the timeline again, so that it's back in the same position that it was, representing the whole length of British history.